We're going to have 4 brief presentations by each of these 4 distinguished panellists who are going to look at different topics relating to services for young adult offenders, literally 5 minutes, and then hopefully there'll be 5 or 10 minutes to open things up. Can I start with you, Chris Callender, who works for the Howard League and is in charge of their legal work, is going to talk about legal aid, I think.
I'll touch upon legal aid. Okay, my name is Chris Callender. I'm a solicitor. We're not all bad. I work for the Howard League for Penal Reform and lead on the legal work we do there. We represent hundreds of children and young adults each year who are in prison or leaving prison. I'm just going to touch upon some of the key issues very quickly indeed. Firstly, I'd say that what underpins our legal aid work or our legal work is the fact that young adults enter the criminal justice system as a direct result of the failure of the welfare system, where welfare interventions fail. By that I mean looking at the duties of local authorities through the Children Act, both for children and as they enter adulthood, and during that transition, our work says that the criminal justice system intervenes and kicks in where the welfare system fails. And that failure is not localised, that failure is national, that failure is in the northeast of England as it is in the southeast of England, in the west and in Wales. And this failure is by statutory agencies failing to recognise that these children and young adults need that assistance and then intervening and complying with their statutory duties. The big society is mentioned. I don't see the big society as a true answer or a big answer to the big problem. The fact is that the kind of work that welfare services is about is not necessarily just for volunteers, it's for professionals, well-resourced, well-trained and well-supported. The protections that should be out there, which we come across in our legal work, might be youth advocacy services, or they may be leaving care teams and leaving care services, sometimes provided by the local authorities themselves, on other occasions provided by charities and other service providers. And it's a concern to us to some extent that going forward this might be the model. And the reality again from the work that we do is that there is a failure to understand by these services the duties, the entitlements of young adults to these services. Big worry then is that they get into conflict situations because they cannot afford to bite the hand that feeds the mouth, or there's just a genuine failure to understand what those services should be delivering and the entitlements of those young people. They are therefore unable to protect and enforce the rights of young adults. And this is the work that we do day in, day out through the legal work, through judicial review, through the High Court. We are able independently to stand up to local authorities, to statutory agencies and say, this is what you should be doing, this is the suitable accommodation, this is the resettlement plan you should be providing for vulnerable young adults. And the experience that we're having is that's not being done. And this government is looking at reform of the legal aid system, and to be fair, so was the last government. And the reduction in legal aid, the failure therefore to enable young adults to access justice, particularly difficult for those in prison, is a massive and big issue as far as we're concerned. It is a false economy, I should say that, to not provide these services. Where those young people are not provided with the welfare support, they are likely to reoffend. And just very finally, I was in prison only yesterday with a young adult who is seeking to apply for release. She has a horrendous history of prolific sexual abuse and neglect, much of which was in the public domain, but no protections, no interventions. And as she said to me in answer to the question, how did you survive? She says, I found the way I survived was on the principle that the money is in the streets. The money is in the streets. She went and took money from the streets, whether that was through prostitution or other offending ways that she found. My concern going forward with austerity, with the cuts that we've partly heard about this afternoon, is that will be the answer for many vulnerable young adults leaving criminal justice or in the criminal justice system today. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Chris. Very interesting. We'll have a chance to consider some of the particular issues facing young women in a minute. But first, I'm delighted to welcome Joyce Moseley from Catch-22, who's going to talk about payment by results, I think. And very pleased to see Joyce. Joyce and I were founder members of the Youth Justice Board, so I suppose we must arrange some sort of party to, as it's being disbanded, and get all the people that were involved together. But over to you, Joyce.
We were of the moment, Rob. Yeah, thank you. Catch-22, we work with young people, young adults, helping them find their ways out of difficult situations, and including, obviously, being involved in the criminal justice system. So as a provider of services, we've put our toe into payment by results, and in the sort of quietness of my own office, I might be heard to say, yeah, come on, bring them on, we can cope. More soberly, in front of you all, I might say, well, let's face it, it's a funding method that's actually here, and let's engage and let's see if we can make it work. I think that's the reality of the moment. So thinking about it, I think the starting point, actually even without payment by results, but the starting point for all providers is actually measuring the outcomes. What are we actually doing? What are we achieving? With payment by results, it's absolutely essential that we are able to measure what we're doing and our outcomes. And I just don't think we're that good at it still in this country about both measuring and sort of really looking at the research, but also of actually using programs and picking up on work that we know has proven outcomes. I suppose I've been really impressed with when I went to Washington State and the work they're doing there, where they have just used relationship-based, evidence-based programs like multisystemic therapy on a system-wide, statewide basis. They've reduced reoffending, and they are building prisons for young people. It had a big impact on me, that, and I do think that we've actually got to get better at it and spend more money on research and looking at those programs and making those programs fit into our system. They have to sort of work within the system. So that's the first thing, getting better at the measuring outcomes, I think. But I do think, payment by results has got a sort of intrinsic feel that it's probably the right thing. I do actually want to be measured on what I achieve, and you feel good when you've achieved it, and let's be measured on it. So I do think we, as providers, try and embrace it, but we know there are huge pitfalls. And I think one of them is those contracts that actually hamper you and impinge on your freedom of working because they're actually input, not outcome-based. Even when they are outcome-focused, I think there's a real problem of getting that balance out of kilter between being challenging and being just downright unrealistic and unachievable. And I think it's actually a very hard balance to get. And I'll say a bit more about that. I'm not sure we're very good at it at the moment. We're so far away, I think, to that partnership approach between commissioner and provider who can problem solve together for the better outcomes that actually we should all be wanting. We seem to be too often behaving as though we're just out to get the better out of each other. The commissioners to screw us down on price and us to, try and sort of fiddle the results in some way. Not a good place to be going. And then, of course, the big pitfall is how, what measures to use. Is it only end results, keeping it simple, reducing reoffending, or is it distance travelled, along those distance routes? Huge issues to be discussed and learning from that. For voluntary organisations, in particular as providers, where's the money coming from? How do we capitalise up front so we can wait to find, to get paid later down the line? And that's for smaller organisations. That's a bigger problem if they're haven't got that ability to borrow. Will the big society bank do anything for us? a question mark. Can social impact bonds go to scale? I certainly hope so, because for providers, those are things that actually place the financial risk with the investors, not with us. And I think it's a good moment to see that actually there's a lot of people putting thought and thinking into these new financial models. And I just, hope we can get to working them out in time. I think there is a time issue here. I think there is an issue for the sorts of young people we talk about. There's something counterintuitive about payment by results, because, let's face it, they're a very challenging group. They're quite unpredictable. They're in a journey. They go backwards and forwards, and can you predict what their outcomes are going to be? And so, how you actually sort of decide on the outcomes and measure them gets hugely difficult. And actually translating all those complexities into metrics that are linked to payments, certainly it's a bigger job than I feel I can do. And I know internally we have lots of discussions about it. And I do worry that we're going headlong into payment by results without either commissioners or providers understanding the subtleties and complexities. There's going to be a disaster. And that would be a real shame, because it'll bring payment by results into disrepute before they've got started. I've sort of tried to think of what practical help could be given. And I was thinking that you almost need a sort of independent mediator when you're setting up contracts, so that somebody can say to the commissioner, come on, you can't expect that much. But on, the provider saying, come on, raise your game a bit, and actually start that negotiating between people. So finally, I went to see some of our staff who were involved in a payment by results contract in around education, and I just wanted to get the feel of how they felt about it. And it was interesting, mixed views, as you can imagine. Some of them feeling very burdened by targets that they felt were unrealistic, so that they'd been set up to fail and were feeling demoralised. Others feeling really exhilarated, how great it is to actually say, yes, I've hit the targets, yes, we're getting paid, but actually hitting the target means we've made a difference to a young person's life, and can actually sort of engage with that process. There is one thing we have to make sure is that you're in charge of your supply chain. Awful word, but that means if you're actually trying to get young people into education, make sure you can get hold of the young people to work with. And you'd be surprised at how difficult that is sometimes when those referral routes don't actually work on time and so on, and you're there waiting to start work and get paid. And the last thing the staff said is, Joyce, sometimes it's a bit lonely working on this very pressured process of earning the money, and the rest of the organisation has to support you, has to help you. All those infrastructure things like your IT has to be ready on time so you can get going on day one, so you can actually start being ahead of the game to reach your targets. So that it's a whole organisation issue that we have to look at if we're going into these contracts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joyce. That certainly gave us a flavour of some of the challenges that you're confronting and await the voluntary sector and others, I guess, over the next few years. Next, we're going to hear from Antonia Bance, who works for the Corston Independent Funders Coalition, a group of charitable funders got together to try and help take forward the recommendations of Jean Corston's review of whatever it was 3 or 4 years ago, which made a lot of excellent recommendations for improving the way women are dealt with when they get into the criminal justice system. Antonia.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone. It's absolutely lovely to be here in such illustrious company and so many people who know so much more than me about working with young people. So I hope I'm not going to tell you about stuff that you already know. Feel free to stop me if I do. I'm Antonia Bance. I work for a group of trusts, foundations and philanthropists, including the Barrow Cadbury Trust, and we work together as the Corston Coalition. Our concern is nothing less than the transformation of how the justice system treats women offenders. Through years, through decades, in some cases, of funding work with women, our members were concerned that without central government will for systemic change, funding individual great innovative services helped only a minority of lucky women. So we thought we'd get involved in the business of systemic change, of policy change, of that radically different set of proposals and ways of running the justice system that Baroness Corston set out. So I'm here to talk about transformation and what those working with young people in transition, young women and young men, can learn from the new ways of working that we've developed for adult women offenders. So, for women offenders and women at risk of offending, the answer to reducing reoffending isn't rocket science. We know what works to reduce reoffending. We know that if you help a woman deal with all of her problems in the order that she says they need to be dealt with, starting with the serious ones, the lack of accommodation, the fact that she can't see her kids, the fact that she hasn't got enough money to get through the week, starting with those ones and building through the range of needs and concerns that she has, that type of intervention will be the type of intervention that helps her reduce her offending and reduce the chaos and exclusion she feels in her life. We would call that a one-stop shop intervention, a women's centre, a women's community project. 2 years ago, there were maybe 5 or 6 of these projects in the UK. Now there are nearly 50. And we may tentatively begin to see some of the impact of a relentless focus on the round, the holistic nature of women offenders' needs and that diversion from custody and from crime. So if you'd gone over the road to Petty France, where the civil servants in the Ministry of Justice sat in 2008 working out how much prison capacity they'd need for women offenders at about sort of March 2011, they would have said to you, well, you know, Antonia, we think we're going to need about 4,500 places for women offenders. And actually, if you said to them then that we'd get to just after Christmas 2011, just after Christmas 2010 rather, at the start of 2011, and would be for the first time in a decade back at the level of 4,000 women offenders in custody, I don't think they would have believed you at that point. Now, we've had a little blip since the start of January, but in general, we're looking at a trend for women offenders in custody that's going in the right direction. And I think most of us would say that the lessons of working together, the lessons of dealing with all of women's needs holistically in the round, what a dreadful piece of jargon, holistically, but all of those needs, through that one intervention, has been a big part of why that's happening. So what are the key messages about that intervention that I'd like you to hear from me? Well, they would be these. Firstly, they provide access to a number of services in one location or through one care plan, one process of referrals that is tailored to that individual woman. So we're not having women trailing around town, different appointments at different times, different people telling their story over and over again. And we're not having women who have needs across a range of issues, but not quite meeting the threshold for intervention on any one of them on their own. Secondly, this may sound an unfashionable thing to say, but the projects work from an understanding of women's needs in an unequal society. Women are a very small minority in the criminal justice system, and that means their specific needs and their ways in and out of offending can often be overlooked. In particular, the criminal justice sector often fails to take account of the impact of rape, domestic violence, and of the impact of the caring responsibilities that so often still fall to women. Finally, the third aspect of the services is that these services assert the belief that change and a better life is possible for women with multiple needs and chaotic lives. They work from the standpoint that chaos, offending, vulnerability, exclusion is not inevitable, and that change and a better life is possible. They support, inspire and challenge their clients to take those steps towards change. Does it work? Well, you've heard me say a little bit about some of the numbers moving in the right direction, a little bit early to tell on some of that. You look at some of the individual projects, and I'm sure none of them would meet Kevin's standards of evidence just yet. But you look at some of the individual projects, and you see some really good movement, whether it be the Swan project, great rural project in Northumberland, which has made a 70% reduction in reoffending for the women that it's worked with, or the Inspire project in Brighton, which has taken a cohort of women on a community sentence for whom the breach rate in Brighton normally stands at 73%, and reduced that breach rate right the way down to 29%. So some good results. And the impact of those numbers is profound. Women offenders will be members of some of our most high-cost, high-need, high-vulnerability families. And reducing that vulnerability gives wins all round. So what are our lessons for you working with the groups that you're working with? They're about seeing the whole person, about understanding the impact of violence and abuse, about putting support, accompaniment alongside the criminal justice intervention, and about forming partnerships across the sectors to deliver better services for some of our most vulnerable young people. Thank you.
Antonia, thank you very much for that. We're going to stay with the theme of women, I think. I'm very pleased to welcome Carlene Firmin, who now works at Bernardo's, but only started last month, I think.
3 weeks in the job.
Oh, okay, 3 weeks in the job. He's mainly, I think, going to talk about some work she did in her previous role at ROTA, Race on the Agenda, about girls and young women and violence.
Yes, I'm going to try and merge them all together in 5 minutes, and I'll do my best. At Bernardo's, my strategic responsibility is around youth justice and child sexual exploitation, so I have to work particularly to represent young women in the justice system, and that's really what I want to focus on. And almost picking up from where Antonia left off, the transition for young women, and young women particularly caught up in the justice system, from youth to adult services can actually be a positive thing, because for once their gender is recognised in service provision, and for young people, gender sometimes becomes a moot point, and young women who are accessing services in the justice system will very often access mixed services that rarely take into account experiences of sexual exploitation, sexual abuse, domestic violence, or any of their gendered experiences of offending full stop. And this doesn't only start at 18. From 16, young women will begin to transition into adult services. If you're talking about sexual health services, for example, they have a completely different attitude towards confidentiality in young women's minds when they turn 16, so the services they then access in regards to violence in relationships, but also sexual violence and rape, will change, and they will begin to access services that they wouldn't have accessed prior to the age of 16. When we look at accommodation, once again, for young women trying to exit violent relationships, for young women trying to exit gangs to whom they may be criminally associated with, for young women who have experienced severe sexual violence, trafficking or sexual exploitation, we are yet to be able to provide refuge provision for them because they are not adults. And the secure centres that we do send them to are once again mixed, and very often do not provide any specialist workers or support that once again recognise the individual needs of young women who are caught up in risky situations or offending behaviour. So a young woman will have to wait till she is 18 to access a refuge space, very often to be placed on a multi-agency risk assessment conference, to receive support from an independent domestic violence advisor or independent sexual violence advisor, and yet the Home Office itself has acknowledged that young women as young as 13 are experiencing violence in relationships which mirrors violence in adult relationships. And as Antonia has pointed out, domestic violence is key in the experiences of women caught up in the justice system. But then when they do make that transition to adult-based services, the importance of their age is lost and the importance of their maturity is lost. Only about 6 months ago, I interviewed a young woman who was 20 and in a refuge accommodation in the north of the country. And by the age of 20, she had been put in a coma at the hands of her boyfriend. She was no longer able to have children because of the domestic violence she had experienced. She'd had a bleed on the brain. She'd had both her legs broken, and she was only 20 years old. So the idea that they have to wait till they're 18 to access a service that recognises their experiences of violence is, to me, unacceptable. In addition, though, she had an offending past, an offending history that had not acknowledged her experience of being a young woman. And when I asked her how her experience was with the youth offending service, the first thing that she said to me was, "How do you think it was? I was the only girl on that order." So for her, her gender and her age were having a real impact throughout her life. And at the age of 20, when I asked her about her experience of being in a refuge, she said to me, "Well, I'm not old enough to be here. Everyone else here is over 35, and everyone that's the same age as me are the children of the women in here. And no one really understands what it is like to be a 20-year-old woman accessing an adult service." So as young women begin the process of transition at the age of 16, particularly in relation to their experience of secure accommodation, and their responses to sexual abuse and victimisation, services require more coordination, and this is across the statutory and voluntary sectors. And I would love to see more partnership working between those that provide services to young people and those that specialise in violence against women provision. Specifically, if such partnerships falter or fail to exist at all, young women will continue to fall through the gaps and their offending or victimisation could intensify. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlene. I think we'll just, if anybody's got one question that they think that all the panellists could have one sentence on, we must move fairly quickly. But if anybody, I mean, what we've heard about is the need to protect the rights of young people in this age group. We've heard about some of the challenges in the payment by results mechanism, and also the need to have specific measures which actually treat the whole person, and particularly in the case of young women. And one of the critiques of the payment by results scheme is that it may not be able to meet some of the specific needs of some of the groups that projects are set up with. I don't know whether that's, that will all remain to be seen. Has anybody got one point they'd like to make before? Yes, Rob.
Of St Giles Trust, and probably be remiss of me if I didn't take this opportunity. Obviously, we've been very involved with social impact bonds and very much involved with payment by results, both which, being a reforming ex-investment banker, you may understand why I'm obsessed about return on investment. And I suppose, for me, the single biggest reason why I'm quite confident about that organisations like St Giles Trust and Catch-22 can make a real difference was some work done by Sir Gus O'Donnell about measuring impact and actually return on investment. And that was able to demonstrate that you were able to create, for every £1 invested in a service delivered by organisations like ourselves, £10 of savings for the state. And I've just got some rather bad news for Elroy, and just to pick up on Kevin here, on the cost, the input costs. Sadly, most of our caseworkers have a load of about 25 to 50 cases a year in bringing down their offending rates. So, Elroy, if it does cost us £18,000 an offender, I'm sorry I'm not paying you £450,000 a year.
Okay.